Okay, everyone. So lecture 5, the last lecture, is lecture on market and infrastructure. And we're going to look at the relationship between market and infrastructure, define infrastructure, again, dwell more on the role of market in a more nuanced way, introduce something called the misallocation hypothesis, which is critical to understanding why poor countries remain poor. So there is one perspective from a solo growth model perspective, and the second perspective is from the misallocation hypothesis. So we haven't done misallocation hypothesis, even though I've been building up to the misallocation hypothesis. The reason we defined Pareto efficiency right at the beginning was because it was so that you get a greater sense of what efficiency is, and misallocation hypothesis will connect to that. So we'll do that. I've also put up the term paper on Moodle, and once we finish the lecture, I'll talk for a couple of minutes about the Moodle, the term paper question, and you can have a look. And if you have any questions about it, you can ask me, and of course we can pick that up later as well. But I'll speak for a couple of minutes about exactly what the term paper is, what the question is, and my advice on how to do it. But we'll do that right at the back end of the lecture. Any questions about previous material or anything that we've covered so far? Just speak up if you have any, okay? Okay, so let's start. So we're gonna start with market specialization and urbanization, the link between the two. So I'm sure most of you have come across Robinson Crusoe. So Robinson Crusoe, the character comes from Daniel Defoe's novel. It's an individual who gets stranded on an island, and he has to survive on the island. He has to make do with whatever he has. Okay, so I'm going to transform this story into something slightly different, which will serve our purpose, and it'll serve us purpose to kind of get us to understand what happens to an economy in autarky. The idea of autarky is an economy that is closed from the rest of the world, right? So if you decide that you're going to stay in a hut in a forest and not talk to anybody, not exchange anything with anybody, right? You're going to fend for yourself, grow your own food, look after yourself, no interaction with it. That would be autarky. The only example of autarky that I can think of is a couple of islands and communities here and there that still have no connection with civilization. So there's an island in the Indian Ocean where there's a particular tribe, and they've never had, this particular tribe in the Indian Ocean, they've never had any contact with humans, the rest of the human civilization. And so they are autarkic. They are kind of, they're also relatively suspicious and hostile to anybody who comes to visit them on the island. So these islands are part of India, and India has made a conscious effort to leave these islands alone. The other example of autarky is North Korea. North Korea is an economy which is largely autarkic. It produces everything, it consumes everything that it produces. It doesn't do significant amount of, it doesn't trade significant amount of things with the rest of the world, right? So what we want to think about is what are the disadvantages of autarky. And the best way to start off is to think about one person stuck on an island, and that's Robinson Crusoe. Let's also imagine that Robinson Crusoe is a very skilled craftsman. So he's extremely valued for his pottery skills in the rest of the world, right? He's famous, but somehow on a ship, got lost, stuck at an island. So what that means is that people around the world value his pottery, but now he's stuck on the island and he cannot send them his pottery, and they can't send him money. He can't use the money to buy anything else. Now, this would be inefficient because the time he spends in trying to kind of climb up coconut trees and get coconut, or try to catch some fish, or to make some equipment to catch fish. That's time he could have spent, kind of producing pottery and selling it to other people, earning large sums of money, and then the food that he's making on his own would be trivial. He will require trivial amount of money to buy that food. But the reason he's not able to do that is because he's cut off from the rest of the world. So the inefficiency in this world results from the fact that he's cut off from the rest of the world, even though, he has something other people want, and the other people are ready to pay a lot for what he has, but he's cut off from the rest of the world, right? So it's inefficient because he's cut off from the rest of the world. And if you think about it, a village in sub-Saharan Africa, or a village somewhere, kind of in Latin America, up in the mountains, they have a similar story. They're cut off from the rest of the world. The reason they're cut off from the rest of the world is usually because their links are relatively limited, right? Bad roads, lack of communication, equipment, inability to buy communication equipment. Incidentally, if you go to YouTube and you search for, what is it called? It's a road. It's a village in China, which in the 1970s decided that it's going to, people in the village decided that they were disconnected from the rest of the world. They weren't connected. So they decided that they're going to build a road. So they were up in the mountains, they're going to build a road, but they needed to cut the road through the mountain. And so I think for a period of 6 months or a year, everyone from the village, all the able-bodied individuals from the village, spent time cutting through the road, digging, and created that road. And now, of course, this road is a bit of a tourist attraction, but it kind of tells you how these individuals who cut off from the road had to actually spend their own effort to create a link, right? So Robinson Crusoe's story is quite useful because it's not just a story about somebody stuck on an island. There are lots and lots of humans who are stuck on islands. And what that basically means is that they're stuck on kind of a piece of land, which is really, really far away from other places. What does that mean? That means that if I want to go to New York, and assuming we're back in a world where you can easily travel, it'll take me 8 hours to get to New York. Chances are, if I wanted to get to one of the islands in Hebrides, it'll take me 2 or 3 days to get there. Distance is relative. Even though Hebrides islands are closer, the transport links are such that I can get there much faster. It's much faster for somebody from Paris to get to London than it is often to get to some other part of France. So we as individuals shape space. So space is not something that's just humans have inherited. Humans have a tendency of shaping space. And as we become developed, as we develop, ability to tax and spend, we shape space more and more. And one of the ways to think about development is people who can shape their space are able to overcome the natural boundaries, whereas people who are not able to shape their space are still stuck in islands of deprivation. So think about Netherlands, how they've shaped their space. They have been able to reclaim land. Think of Norway, how they have shaped their space. They have been able to create roads in a really, really difficult terrain. So by definition, developed countries are ones that are not necessarily just lucky in terms of the geography they inherit, but they also have an ability to shape the geography. And so there used to be a geography argument for development, and that seems to be something that we don't buy into now. Okay, so let's take this further. So a region that is cut off from the rest of the world has to produce everything on its own, and that's inefficient. And the reason it's inefficient is because people can be made better off through trade without anybody being worse off, right? And that's the principle the Ricardian principle of comparative advantage, right? So it's different from the principle of absolute advantage. And there is a link to that. You can read the difference between comparative and absolute advantage. But the idea of comparative advantage is take any two people, they always will have comparative advantage in something. And the idea of comparative advantage is that if you have comparative advantage, you always have something to trade with. So I think I gave you this example earlier, but I'm going to repeat that example again. Let's say you have a lawyer who is able to earn £500 an hour by giving legal advice. The lawyer, she hires a secretary who is able to type at 50 words per minute. The lawyer is able to type at 80 words per minute. So the lawyer types faster than the person she hires. The person she hires obviously cannot give legal advice. Not obvious, but let's assume they can't. So it turns out the lawyer is much better in terms of typing as well as legal advice, but she still hires a secretary. So in terms of absolute advantage, she has an absolute advantage in terms of both typing skills and legal skills, but she still hires a secretary. And the reason she does is because every hour that she frees up from not typing, she can earn £500. The person she's got, he types at 50 words per hour, so he's slower. She can pay him a significant amount of money, a couple of $100, pounds an hour, and she's still better off because the 1 hour that she would have wasted on typing and not earned anything, she can earn £500, pay somebody, right? So now the thing that emerges is from this is that even though the lawyer has an absolute advantage in both typing and legal skills, the lawyer has a comparative advantage in legal skills because she is more efficient or kind of more productive in terms of legal skills than she's on typing. And in relative terms, the person, the person who's been hired as a secretary has a comparative advantage in typing. What you take from that? What you take from that is find any two random people in the world. They'll always have a comparative advantage. They may not, one person may have an absolute advantage in everything, but if you take them, if you think of comparative advantage, at least one of them will have comparative advantage. So now this is an idea due to David Ricardo around the same time that Adam Smith was thinking about markets. And David Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage feeds into Adam Smith's concept of market. Because if everyone has a comparative advantage, that means everyone has something to trade in a market, which means if you can let the market function, then everyone would keep trading. And once all the trades have taken place, once all the economic opportunities have been exhausted, by definition, you would have reached a Pareto optimal situation. You would have reached a Pareto efficient outcome, because at that point, anybody who has a potential trade where they value something more, but they haven't got it, they would not exist because all the economic opportunities have been exhausted. So Ricardian principle, David Ricardo, and these are really fundamental ideas in economics, 200 years old, the fundamental ideas in economics. So Ricardo's principle is everyone has a comparative advantage. Adam Smith comes and says, look, if you put a bunch of people in the market, they will keep trading till they've exhausted all their opportunities, which means they would have reached a Pareto efficient outcome, which means set up a market. If it functions properly, you will always exhaust all the economic opportunities of society and get to Pareto efficient outcome. Okay, so with specialization, the output of the economy increases, which facilitates private accumulation of capital through the investment channel and public goods provision to the fiscal channel. So what we got from solar model, the fiscal channel and the saving investment channel, is that you would be at a situation which would be Pareto efficient, right? So the link here is that if markets work, you'll be at Pareto efficiency. And we'll talk more on this a bit later, but one of the key assumptions of Solo was that markets work, right? So in a Solo, there was no sense in which markets did not work. So we saw in the Kerala fish example that the markets were not working, but Solo is an abstract model. And Solo doesn't say anything about markets not working. Solo says if markets work, what do you get, right? Right. So this is kind of a bit of a, there is very little that's new, but this is basically just a wrap up of what we've been doing. Okay. And do shout if you have any questions. Now, let's think about infrastructure, right? Because we've thought about market, and we've been talking about public capital, and we talked about public capital and the definition of public capital. So what is public capital? Well, what you have is output in each period that's consumed, and the non-consumed output can either become savings or can become tax, right? So you can either pay tax or become saving. The tax goes to the government and becomes public capital. The saving goes to the bank, and from the bank becomes private capital, right? So firms borrow, buy back capital good, right? So what is infrastructure here? So infrastructure here has three different definitions, and all of them are vague definitions. They're not perfect definitions. And the reason they are vague definitions is because nobody's bothered to define infrastructure properly. This is one of the kind of lacunas, because it's not been conceptually defined. It's often, we think of infrastructure as, if I see infrastructure, I should be able to tell you that it's infrastructure. And this is one of the areas that I've got really interested in, and it's one of the things that I've started working on, partly because I did the course, but partly because everyone keeps talking about infrastructure, and when you ask for a definition, they don't have a clear definition. So the question is, a corner shop here in London or in Cambridge is not infrastructure, right? It's definitely not infrastructure. Roads are, but a corner shop is not. But a corner shop in Ullapool in the north end of Scotland, is that infrastructure? Well, if it disappears, a lot of people would be inconvenienced. So chances are they think of it as infrastructure. A privately held post office in London, in the middle of a street, is not infrastructure, but a post office in a small village in the middle of England is infrastructure, right? So the notion of infrastructure is slightly complicated, and there are three different definitions. So this, by the way, I should have given a reference, but I'll remember to add the reference later on. But these three definitions come, at least two definitions come from a paper by Gramlich. This is almost a 30-year-old paper. So it's a paper by Gramlich, and it was a period where there was work on infrastructure, and then of course this literature died out. I'm hoping to revive this literature, but Gramlich he uses two definitions in the survey article. The first definition is large capital-intensive natural monopolies, such as highway, transport facilities, water, civil lines, communication systems. So what is the definition of infrastructure? Monopolies. And why are they monopolies? Because they are large infrastructure-intensive monopolies. So they have increasing returns to scale. And because they have increasing returns to scale, they're natural monopolies. So anything that has very, very high increasing returns to scale, they are natural monopolies. Why? Because if they have very high degree of increasing returns to scale, then for any market, you don't want more than one. Having two different firms running it or 4 different units running it is wasted, because then you split. And when you split, it becomes more costly to provide that particular service, like sewer lines or transport. And so, you can't split it. And there are high degrees of increasing returns to scale. So they naturally become natural monopolies. And, in the
privatization period, kind of phase in UK, we found that you could privatize airports, you can privatize telecom, not very difficult to do. But what is difficult to privatize is the network on which telephone lines work. So that is still held by BT. That is difficult because there are huge increasing returns to scale in terms of the lines under the ground. Similarly, the rail tracks have increasing returns to scale. So even though you can have private companies running on the rail tracks, but if you try to split rail tracks, there's such increasing returns to scale that they become inefficient, right? And so we found that after privatization, the privatization was done in the 80s, in the 90s, things just did not work. There were a huge amount of problems. The tracks were not being looked after. There were also a couple of accidents. One of them was a famous accident in Hatfield, a train that was traveling from London to Scotland, derailed in Hatfield. Am I right? Yeah, I think it was Hatfield. And so there was these difficulties, and people realized that rail track, you can privatize the running of the trains because there aren't such significant increase in returns to scale. But when it comes to running rail track, they're increasing returns to scale, so they can't be split. So that's one definition, natural monopolies, because they have very high degree of increasing returns to scale. The second is tangible capital stock that is just owned by public sector. So this is called the ownership definition. So the ownership by public capital. So if it's owned by public sector, then it's infrastructure. Now, here, the definition is good in terms of describing things, but it doesn't tell you why it's infrastructure. Is the government making a mistake by owning something it doesn't need to? Or is the government needs to own that particular capital stock in the public hands? So behind the Iron Curtain, the governments were producing everything. They were producing cars, they were producing ovens, right? And we know from experience that you don't need government to produce ovens and cars. Similarly, in India in the 80s, you found that the government at some point got involved in producing televisions. And it makes no sense. Why was the government using public money to produce televisions? It makes no sense. So the problem with the second definition is that it defines things in a way so that it describes a reality, but it doesn't tell you conceptually why it's infrastructure. So if a less than benevolent dictator in a country decides to own a particular company, that becomes infrastructure, and that doesn't make any sense. So it's not a conceptual definition. The third definition is kind of a mishmash, which says public goods provided by public sector that are either underprovided or not provided by the private sector, right? So it's the third definition is about public goods, and it kind of captures more because it captures law and order as infrastructure, right? So if you think about law and order is infrastructure. Without law and order, everything will fall apart. It's not physical, but it's equally important. Healthcare is social infrastructure. Education is social infrastructure. So the third definition says public goods provided by the public sector. Why? So why is public goods being provided by the public sector? Because we know from the definition of public sectors that public goods are non-excludable and non-rival, which means under either of these conditions, the market will not be able to provide it. So if it's not excludable, everyone can use it. So why would anybody pay for it? It's non-rival. That means the marginal cost of producing it is zero, right? So, in any kind of market, firms will be driven down to the marginal cost. If they have the right, if they have the incentive to compete. So, and if the marginal cost is zero, then the market doesn't work. Why would anybody pay anything. Why would anybody get involved if the marginal cost of producing it is zero? So with public goods, the market doesn't work. And so the idea of infrastructure is these goods are either over provided or under provided, right? So pollution is a public good. Why? Because you can't exclude anybody. If you produce pollution, everyone gets affected by it. If you produce air pollution, everyone. You can't exclude people. In this case, we often think of exclude as in, can you keep somebody out? But in this case, with the pollution, you don't want to go in. You don't want to be involved. You don't want to breathe the pollution, but you can't be excluded. You can't be excluded. So pollution is a public good, which is over provided, whereas health and education might be a public good that might be under provided, right? So this definition says public good which is under provided by the private sector. You need the public sector to step in, right? And the thing gets slightly more complicated because in this case, by this definition, BBC is infrastructure, right? By this definition, schools are infrastructure. And why are schools infrastructure? Because the private sector underprovides it. Private sector only would provide schools. At least in UK, we know they provide schools, which are relatively expensive. So, people who are not able to pay that high price would not get the school. So the government steps in and provides more than that. I'll keep it aside, but education is also a merit good. It's something that benefits the society, and it's you kind of, from a moral perspective, you should get it. But that's not related to what we're talking. It's just an aside. Right. Any questions? No. Right. Okay. So we got the definition of infrastructure. Hello. We got a definition of infrastructure out of the way. So markets and infrastructure, right? So transport and communication are critical. Without transport and communication, you're stranded on an island, right? So you're stranded on an island for two reasons. Transport, you can't, because you can't move goods, and communication, because you're not able to access the price. So these are the themes that we thought about when we were looking at the Kerala fish market. Electricity. Now, the example of electricity is quite interesting because electricity is a complement. What it does is it makes both capital and labor more productive, right? So if you have physical capital, electricity provides mechanical energy or is able to generate computing power. And so without electricity, that's not going to work. So the electricity complements, right? So this is the word complement and substitute. When you substitute something, then you can use either this or that. When you complement something, then thing A helps thing B, right? So example of this is if you walk into a bar and you think beer and chips crisp are substitutes, that means you don't care about having both. You just want one. So you either want beer or you want crisp. You can substitute them for each other. But if you think that having crisp enhances the taste of beer and the beer enhances the taste of crisp, then they're complements, right? So we often think of wine as something that complements the food, right? So we can think of wine as something that complements the food, but one type of food may be a substitute for another, right? So going back to this, electricity, what it does is enhances the productivity of both capital and labor. Why does it enhance the productivity of capital? Because electricity gives it mechanical or computing power. So any physical capital, right? So so you're a firm, you have a loan from the bank, and you can buy capital goods. If you buy capital goods which uses energy, so electricity, and electricity is produced, it's freely available in the society, not freely available, freely accessible in the society, that you pay a reasonable price and you can get electricity, then electricity will make it work more efficiently. Alternative, if there's no electricity, you'll buy something that doesn't use electricity, and you'll produce much less of it. So think of people who are making orange juice. If you're making orange juice, you can buy a juice maker and use electricity, and it'll produce a lot of juice. Whereas if you can't, you'll have to do it with the hand, and you get these hand machines where you put in the orange, you chuck it along, you move it along, but the rate at which you'll produce orange would be, you'll produce very little orange, right? So electricity dramatically makes capital more productive. It also makes labor more productive, because without electricity, you can only work in daylight. With electricity, you can work in night as well. With electricity, you can work when it's cold, because it heats, it provides heat, or when it's too hot, it provides, it could potentially provide fan or air conditioning. So electricity complements both labor and capital, right? And we often find that electricity is quite key. Surprisingly, electricity is one of the biggest lacunas in developing countries. So I have a link in the reading list. I've just added it yesterday. It's a talk by Paul Romer. And Paul Romer is one of the most fascinating, rebellious, radical economist. So he won a Nobel Prize a few years ago, but most people who win Nobel Prizes are people who tend to be kind of figureheads in economics. Everyone looks up to them. Whereas Romer is absolutely radical. He's been challenging economics. He keeps, kind of pushing people in economics. So he's not somebody who's kind of, he's not somebody who's kind of, he's not somebody who believes in making friends. He believes in doing good work, and he believes in doing good work and changing the world. Anyway, that's just his background. And he has this fascinating talk where he starts off by showing you a photograph. So it's a TED talk. I would encourage you to click on the link and listen to him. It's an 18-minute talk. He's quite entertaining. What he's talking about is the next step from this course. So if we were doing this course not for 5 weeks, but we were doing the course for next 10 weeks, we would have started talking about what Roma is talking about, right? So we're not talking about it right now because we're just doing the basics. If we had to take the next step, we would start talking about what Roma is talking about. But in the first couple of minutes, he talks about a particular example that you will relate to from this lecture. So he takes a photograph, he shows you a photograph of people sitting on a street. So they're sitting one after another, young kids sitting one after another under a tube light, a street light, and they're all doing their homework, right? So, and that's not an uncommon thing. That's not an uncommon thing in developing countries, that electricity is very difficult to get. You might get electricity for a few hours, but it's nothing you can predict on. It's nothing that's predictable. So, light, something that is so easy to produce. We've known how to produce light for 150 years. Technologically, it's not complicated at all. So they don't have access to light, so they have to sit on the street and do their homework. And I think you still have a very, very large proportion of the world who doesn't have access to clean water and clean water and clean environment and electricity. But the photographs is also interesting because they all have mobile phones. And he asks something really interesting. His question is really interesting. He says, why is it that these people do not have 150-year-old technology, which is electricity, but they have a technology in their hand, which is mobile phones, which is literally 20 to 30 years old, right? And so, part of the story is that electricity is a natural monopoly, and it's a public good, and so it doesn't work easily in a market. Whereas mobile phones, the network of the mobile phone may have some increasing returns to scale, as we discussed when we were talking about the fish market, but to a large extent, to a large extent, mobile phones don't have increasing readiness to scale, and you can get private players to provide mobile phone, right? And so infrastructure has this interesting thing, which is markets do not work, markets do not provide infrastructure because they are usually public goods. But also the ownership is important because the government owns it, sometimes it's not able to provide it because the government is not very good. It's not very good at functioning. Whereas the private sector tends to be better in terms of functioning because their objectives are clear. Everyone has a very clear objective. If they make a profit, they get paid. People share on the share the profit. Whereas in the government, nobody's very clear what their objective is. A government which is run where people hold the government accountable, are able to hold the government accountable, there the government might have some incentive. But often in a large country, that's more difficult. Okay, so back to this. The relationship between market and infrastructure is slightly tenuous. Right. So this is where urbanization comes in. Because urbanization dramatically reduces the cost of providing infrastructure in urban areas because the population density is extremely high, right? So that's what we did last time when we did collier and Venables, that the cost decreases dramatically. And so developing countries, which often do not have enough, they're not able to tax enough. Why? Another long story, but let's take it as given for now. If you want a bit of a story, my paper on 2018 talks about why collecting tax in developing countries is more difficult. One is there's less economic activity, but the second bit is that even collection of the tax in developing countries is very expensive. So urbanization offers you some kind of respite because low density is more likely to create lots and lots of Robinson Crusoe pockets, which are disconnected, right? So if you take Africa, which is relatively low density, connecting up all the people who live in different parts of a country is extremely expensive. The government doesn't have any economic activity that it can task to make infrastructure to do that, right? So that's one aspect. But there's also the other aspect, which is when they do it wrong, and they do it in a way where they follow ethnic favoritism, what we did last week. But we'll come to the second aspect, right? So urbanization can solve the problem because what urbanization does is urban areas where the density goes up, you can provide the public goods, which are complementary to capital and labor, which means firms become more productive. And once they become more productive, they start generating tax revenue, and the government starts getting surplus, and then can start kind of building infrastructure in the rural areas, right? So that's the process we saw in Kenya. We saw a process in Kenya where the economy was at a stage where it has enough surplus to build road in rural areas. You also have a lot of countries which are so poor that they just don't have money. Think of Sudan, think of Somalia. They don't have money. If you think of India and China, they're past that stage. They are past that stage. They are past the stage where they don't have money to build infrastructure. They are building infrastructure. There are other issues, and we'll come to what kind of likely explains India and China. So let's simply look at population density, and what we find is a huge variation. So if you look at East Asia, it strikes, it will strike you as relatively, it's an outlier because it has a very, very high density, right? Part of this is being driven by the fact that, Singapore gets counted in East Asia, and Singapore is extremely dense. But even otherwise, East Asia is extremely dense. South Asia is fairly dense as well. Southeastern Asia is dense. But when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, the density is much less, right? And so where the density is very low, right? Western Europe again is relatively dense, right? So in areas where the density is high, up arrow, it's easier. Areas where the density is low, it starts becoming more difficult to provide public goods, right? And start off the economic activity. North America has a very low density, but North America is it's a spectacular example of a place where if you had to take a look at it and just look at geography and population density and all other things, you would never predict that it is one of the richest countries in the world. But turns out America kind of defies a lot of logic. Okay, right. So population patterns, Asia and Europe have a high population density. North America has a relative low population density, but North America, just like Netherlands, just like Norway also has a low population density. It's been able to transform its geography by the sheer fact that it has enough tax to spend and build infrastructure, and geography doesn't matter anymore. Whereas if you're a poor country and you don't have the money to modify the geography, then what you have to think is, and Paul Collier and Anthony Belopoulos tells us one way out of that is to have high population density areas where you can provide transport, communication, all the kind of infrastructure goods that are important for production in a concentrated way. And then what emerges also is development of markets in these urban areas, and that can kickstart the development process. Okay, so that kind of gives you a flavor of the ideas that we've been talking about. Now, what I want to do is critically evaluate the solo growth model. And then I want to introduce this new theory called the misallocation hypothesis, because misallocation hypothesis is all the rage now. Solo growth model tells us something, but misallocation hypothesis is the latest kid in town, and it kind of is. I mean, a lot of people think misallocation hypothesis tells you a lot more in terms of why developing countries are poor. Okay, so in solo growth model, what are the critical assumptions? The critical assumptions are constant returns to scale. Why did we have constant returns to scale? Well, we had constant returns to scale because it was important for aggregation, right? So what constant returns to scale did was it allowed us to aggregate. So we could understand a particular firm, and we could extrapolate what is happening at the firm to the level of the economy. So, if you don't have exactly constant returns to scale, it's not the end of the world. The next thing was diminishing marginal productive capital. So diminishing marginal productive capital was critical because as you became more capital intensive, as each worker got more and more capital, the capital at its margin was less and less productive. So at some point, when you started adding more and more capital, it kind of get counteracted by depreciation and all the other variables. And right, so that's why you got to a steady state and couldn't go. So before you got to a steady state, you could dynamically grow to the steady state. But once you got to the steady state, you couldn't go. And that was entirely because of diminishing returns to marginal capital. The third assumption that we may not have talked as much about, but it was implicit and obvious, was that the markets work perfectly. So in the solo growth model, we don't have a problem with markets not working. In the Kerala fish market, the markets weren't working. But Kerala fish market, right, kind of is an added layer on top of solo growth model, because the solo growth model is telling you right at the outset, if markets work, what would you get, right? So the key thing I'm going to say here is this, and it's important for you to remember this, is that solo growth model tells you what the solo growth model gives you a Pareto efficient outcome. So what solo growth model is saying is that markets work, they allocate all the goods to its right use and ensure the economy is always Pareto efficient. That means all the mutually beneficial transactions have taken place. So solo growth model telling you that an economy is efficient, yet it is poor, right? So it's not poor because it's inefficient. It's poor in spite of being efficient, okay? What are the
Yeah.
different, yeah,
I have a question regarding the
sure.
solid model is efficient. Do transaction costs still exist in the efficient market in the solid growth model? Transaction cost, does it exist?
So yes, the transaction cost would exist,
Mhm.
but uh, transaction cost still allow you to get to a Pareto efficient outcome,
Oh, okay. Thank
right?
you.
So the key thing to remember is that if you have an information problem, right? If you have an information problem, or if you have a public goods problem, then the markets don't work, okay? But transaction cost is not a problem with the efficiency.
Okay, great. Thank
Okay,
you.
okay, okay. Yeah. Are you thinking about the Kerala's fish market?
Yeah, yeah.
So the key thing in Kerala fish market was that it was not the transaction cost, it was the cost of getting the price, right? It was not the cost of reaching the market, right? The cost of reaching the market was not what made it inefficient. The fact that you did not know the price is what created the inefficiency. Is that clear?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. And the last bit is that if transaction cost created inefficiency, then you would never get an efficient market because there's always some transaction cost, however tiny it is. Okay. Um, the last bit, sorry, who is this? Chenlu, right? Who was
Yeah,
speaking? Yeah. The
yeah.
last bit is that, let me just clarify this, because when economists talk about transaction cost, they talk about transaction cost simply as saying, something that costs you to get to the market. When you need to pay for information, non-economists sometimes call that a transaction cost, right? But economists don't call it a transaction cost. Okay. And it's slightly a complicated sets of reasons why, because information cost is not considered a transaction cost. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.
All right. And the reason it's not considered information is not considered transaction cost because lack of information dramatically changes the nature of the transaction. Whereas a transaction cost is just a cost, it doesn't change the nature of the transaction. Questions in this, I'm happy to kind of, you know, go back and think about this. It's a really good question, by the way. It's a really, really good question. It kind of shows that you're thinking about this deeply. And if you have more questions even after the course ends, I'm very happy to, just drop me a line, and I'm very happy to answer those questions. Okay. So now there are different types of markets in the solo growth model. We talked about them, but we never explicitly said, what's happening in this market, because we just assumed they were working. The first market is the labor market, right? So the firms hire workers, right? When they hire workers, uh, if workers get hired and they get to pay their price, and wherever the workers is valuable, firms hire them. There's no problem in finding a worker. Then the labor market's working. The other market that's working is the market for consumer goods. Firms produce consumer goods, people can buy it, that market works. The third market is a market for capital goods, right? So the market for capital goods is non-consumed output, right? So the non-consumed output uh, becomes capital goods. And in Robinson Crusoe world, that's quite easy to understand, right? So in Robinson Crusoe world, the amount of time, so consumer goods are represented by the amount of time Robinson Crusoe spends in making things which he can consume. Capital goods are represented by the amount of time he spends in making things that he can use to catch fish or to climb the tree. So now, when we think of output that cannot be consumed, it can either become capital goods and consumer goods, and it's always a puzzle. How can something which is consumer good become capital good, and how can capital good become consumer good? And the idea is slightly deeper here. Our idea is all the resources that are used to produce capital goods can be redirected to produce consumer goods, and all the resources that are used to produce consumer goods can be redirected to produce capital goods, right? So you kind of, a company like is producing something to do with plastic, it can produce things, plastic toys that are consumer goods, but it can also start producing some kind of some kind of a tool that can be used to make cakes, and that becomes a capital good, right? So the idea was the capital goods market work, and underlying the capital goods market is the functioning of the banking sector or the financial sector, where anything that's not consumed by the people becomes saving, and then it gets lent out to firms, and the firms use that to buy capital goods, right? So these markets were working. And I'm gonna give you a really nice example of a paper of how this doesn't work in most developing countries. And we'll do a particular paper from India, where they used a policy to kickstart the kind of saving and crediting market. And basically the problem was it worked in urban areas, but it didn't work in rural areas. So we're going to look at that. Okay. Now, having said this, the solo growth model has two kinds of growth. One is when you're growing towards an equilibrium, but once you reach an equilibrium, a steady state, you don't grow. So the question is, why are countries poor in steady state? Well, one reason is that they have very low savings rate. That's one explanation from the solo model. The second explanation is that they have high depreciation rate or high rates of population growth, or A, and next slide we'll talk a little bit more about A, but A, the labor productivity factor, right? So the production function was Y is F K A L. So A, the productivity factor doesn't grow fast enough, right? So what we knew is that what happens in a steady state in solo growth model is that the K by AL stops growing. So K by L, capital per labor, and Y by L. So by the way, K by Y by AL and K by L stops growing. So what happens in a steady state is that K by L and Y by L grows at the rate G, which is the growth rate of A. Why? Because if you look at KAL, if K is growing at 5%, then L has to grow at 3% and A has to grow at 3% for this to remain constant. That means if K by L, if you write it like this, that means K by L is growing at 5 minus 3%. A is growing at 2%. So that means K by L is growing at 2%. It would also imply that Y by L is growing at around 2%, right? Slightly less than that, but let's not worry about that. That's not important. So the idea is the reason why there you get growth in the steady state is because A, the labor productivity factor keeps growing. And if that is low, then people's per capita income grows at a lower rate. So two main things come out, which is countries are poor because of low saving rates and low rate of growth of A. Depreciation rate across the world doesn't vary that much. Population growth doesn't vary that much also, right? So, but these two factors are often taken more seriously. Turns out, this is not a particularly satisfactory situation, because if we look at correlation, if you look at statistically different countries, we find that poor countries tend to have a relatively higher rate of savings. Rich countries tend to have a low rate of saving. So it's counterintuitive, because a low saving rate should actually mean that the rich countries should be poor, but that's not true, right? So saving rates is not a good explanatory factor, right? So it turns out everything starts depending on A. Okay. So at some point earlier in the lectures, I think in lecture end of lecture 2, somebody had asked me about A, and I had said, I'll come back to this, and it's taken a while, but here we are. Let's talk more about A. So what is A, right? So what is A? If you think about Y is K alpha AL 1 minus alpha. So Y can be written as a general production function, okay? But let's give a particular functional form to it. So Y is, and this is the Cobb-Douglas production function, right? It's simply saying Y is K times K to the power alpha, AL to the power 1 minus alpha, okay? Now it turns out this is visible, okay? So it's visible. Capital stock is visible in the economy, and labor is visible in the economy, right? So we can see the capital stock all around us. We can see the output all around us. It's easy. National income accounts measures it. The government, through this national income accounting exercise, measures it. So we can count the number of people who are working. Turns out A is a bit more complicated, because A here is intangible or invisible, right? So A here we don't know, right? So A here we don't know. A is intangible or invisible, right? Now it turns out, what is A? At the beginning of the course, I gave you a really simple idea that A was anything that affects labor productivity. But turns out that's a good way to get started, so that you understand what's happening in the solar growth model. But that's not the complete answer. It's a bit of a kind of a simplistic answer, which gets you started. And if you've looked at the solar growth model and kind of got a sense of it, then I'm going to give you the more complicated answer, which is, what is A? We don't know. And why do we not know? Because A is something that we can't track. We can track the increase in capital and labor in the economy, and we can track the increase of output. But if the output goes up, because of some reason, which is not related to more workers working in the firm or more capital being employed in the firm, then that means there's something mysterious about A. It could be all kinds of reasons. It could be better quality air. It could be some kind of a new plan that workers have come up with or managers have come up with. It could be better infrastructure, electricity. If we can't see electricity, or normally we can, but if we can't see electricity and we don't account for it in the data, then electricity could be A. A is what we can't see. Abramovich in 1956 said, A is a measure of ignorance. Okay, so we can measure output, capital, and labor, but we can't measure A. So anything that cannot be measured becomes A. So the idea normally is this, that if you look at the economy and say capital is growing at, what is the number I used? Let's say capital, let's start again. Let's say capital is growing at 1%, and labor is also going at 1%, okay? And alpha is half, okay? So it turns out, if capital and labor are going by 1%, but you find that the output is growing by 5%, turns out output is growing much faster than capital labor, it must be because A is growing at a fairly high rate. What rate would A have to grow at? This is the growth rate of A. So the growth rate of A. So from this, what you get is growth rate of Y is alpha growth rate of K plus 1 minus alpha growth rate of A plus growth rate of L. We can replace growth rate of A by G, because we always think of G as growth rate of A. So that means G is equal to this, right? So at any point in time, we can measure the growth rate of A. We call it G, the growth rate of A. Why? Because, by the way, I made a mistake here. I'm really sorry. This should be, so I'm going to correct that mistake. So I'll correct the slides later, but this should be growth rate of it. So we know the growth rate of, Y, we know the growth rate of L, we know the growth rate of K. We need the value of alpha. And what is alpha? Alpha usually is taken as the share of capital income in the economy. So what proportion of the income in the economy goes to capital? Why? It's slightly more complicated. It comes from the Cobb-Douglas production function. If you manipulate it around, you can show through derivation that if markets work, and if factors get paid their marginal product, so if interest rate is equal to, and here I'm talking about something that is slightly beyond the course because I've not done it. I don't know if you've done it in one of your early economic courses, but basically if interest rate is equal to marginal product of capital and wage is equal to marginal product of labor, then alpha would be share of capital and 1 minus alpha would be share of labor. Usually alpha, the usual value for alpha in the economy tends to be 0.4. So 1 minus alpha tends to be 0.6. 60% of the labor income goes to output, 60% of the total income goes to labor, and 40% goes to capital. It can go up a little more. It can be 0.5, 0.3, but generally it's in that range. Okay, is that clear? Now, when we generally talk in the economy, we think of productivity, and it's really confusing because people use productivity for two different measures. And it kind of really irritates the hell out of me because, a lot of things get confusing because people talk about productivity. And when they talk about productivity, it's not very clear which version of productivity they're talking about. So the first version of productivity is really easy to measure. Its productivity is take the output of a firm or economy and divide it by the number of workers. So what is the output per worker, right? So that's one measure of productivity, and that's the kind of easy measure of productivity people normally use. So now it turns out, why would the output per worker in a firm go up? Well, if you get more capital, if you get electricity, if you get better market access, your output per worker would go up. So the problem with output per worker as a measure of productivity is that it doesn't tell you why you're getting more output per worker. It may have nothing to do with the worker, right? So it may have nothing to do with actual productivity, right? It may be just that you have electricity. You may have just got access to, you may have got a new road. That's really not productivity, right? Colloquially, when we think of productivity, we think people working harder, right? So one measure of productivity is output per worker, but its advantage is that it's really easy to measure. The disadvantage is that it doesn't tell you much. Yeah? So when somebody usually says the productivity in the economy has gone down, right? Or let's put it another way. If somebody usually says developed countries are more productive, well, if they're using output per worker, Obviously, developed countries are going to be more productive because developed countries have more capital. So, you have more capital. If you have more capital, you can use the capital, and the worker would be more productive if they use the capital. So that's one version. The second version of productivity is called total factor productivity. And that is the measure of increase in output that is not due to either capital or labor, right? And so what it is doing now is saying, let's remove the influence of labor from output, right? So if you have more labor, you'll produce more output. Let's remove that influence. If you have more capital, you produce more output. Let's remove that influence. You get left behind with A, which is a total factor productivity, which means you've taken care of all the factors, total amount of factors, and you're left with A, and that's a bit of a mystery, right? So total factor productivity A is more refined version of productivity. Okay, I hope that's clear, right? And so in the solo growth model, turns out in the solo growth model. So by the way, A, how do we calculate A? As we said, if you have the growth rate of K, growth rate of L, and growth rate of Y, from that, and you have alpha, from that you can derive the growth rate of this thing, which is growth rate of A. Okay, so that's how you measure total productivity. And total productivity has problems because you need to be able to measure capital properly. So if you're not measuring capital properly, you'll get the wrong measure of productivity. If you're not measuring alpha properly, the share of capital income or share of labor income properly, you'll have a problem in terms of measuring total productivity. So total productivity is difficult to measure. It's contaminated by all the things we need to estimate, whereas output per worker is much easier. Output is easier to count. Dividing it by number of workers is trivial. You don't have to kind of even count the amount of capital. So output per worker is more accurate, but is more generic. Total productivity is more accurate, but is more difficult. Why are we talking about productivity? Because misallocation hypothesis says something about productivity. So what is a misallocation hypothesis? Right. Now, when we come to misallocation hypothesis, we're talking about something that was born. The idea was born with a paper 11 years ago, actually 12 years ago, in 2009. Hershing Chang wrote this paper in 2009. So it's a really new idea. Chances are, kind of most development courses or more infrastructure courses do not talk about misallocation because it's something that is still very, very new in terms of research. It's been literally 12 years since this idea was properly formalized in development. Right. So, you can't complain that I'm not teaching you the latest stuff. Right. So the misallocation hypothesis states that the output of the economy is low because the factor inputs like capital and labor are suboptimally allocated within the economy, which means capital and labor do not find their optimal use, right? So what does that mean? That means you're running a coffee shop, you want to hire a manager, you can't find the right manager. You're running a coffee shop, you want to buy the equipment for your coffee, you can't buy the right equipment, right? You have extremely skilled people in the economy, but they don't get hired for some reason, right? So if capital and labor are not correctly matched, they can't produce the potential output, right? And there is scope for Pareto improvement. So it turns out misallocation occurs if markets do not function properly, right? Now, turns out if you read these papers, so I have the reference, they don't mention the thing about markets. But if we were to kind of compare this, if you want to take a bit of because they do a more detailed calculation, the Hershing Chang paper, they do a more detailed calculation. But if you step back, the issue with Pareto, the issue with solo growth model was telling you why economies are poor because because of a certain level of things, but markets work. So it was telling you, if markets work, why would the economy be poor? Now it turns out misallocation hypothesis which tells you further that even from the potential, you could be underperforming for the potential because the markets are not working properly. Now, turns out why this is useful, because solo growth model tells you something really useful about the growth process, right? It tells you something really useful about the growth process, but it kind of misses out a really significant point, which is it doesn't tell you why countries are so poor, right? Because it can tell you why countries are little poor, but it can't tell you why countries are so poor. And what it's saying is that for China, the potential output, if there's no misallocation, is 50% higher than what it is now. For India, it's closer to 60% higher. So India would be 60% richer, per capita income would be 60% higher if there was no misallocation. So, it's kind of a complicated paper, but they are actually able to calculate. Now, what that basically means is that misallocation occurs in two different ways. One way in which misallocation occurs is that the factors are not properly allocated, right? So if you have workers in skilled workers in one part of the economy, but you have another part of the economy which is looking for skilled workers, if they are not able to find each other, right, that's misallocation. And you can actually see how the bigger the country, the lower the population density of the country, the lower the transport and communication equipment, the more mismatch you get, right? One would think that with the advent of internet, everything would be easier, but turns out internet is actually making things more difficult, because now you can get information cheaply, but there is a jungle from which you have to find information, right? So if you're trying to hire somebody, internet means that if you find them, it's very easy to communicate. But in this jungle of internet, finding somebody, because there's just so much information, right, it's difficult. So turns out internet is not, doesn't completely solve this problem. But you can see how an island Robinson Crusoe economy has extreme degree of misallocation, right? It has extreme degree of misallocation because Robinson Crusoe, and this is why I started with Robinson Crusoe's example, Robinson Crusoe was misallocated. He got stuck on an island. If he had produced a pottery, people were ready to pay for the pottery, but he got misallocated because he's got stuck in an island. So that kind of symbolizes the misallocation hypothesis. I'm going to go through a bunch of, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Are there multiple Pareto efficient outcomes, or is it like so could you have like two Pareto efficient outcomes with different levels of output?
Absolutely. So you get a whole Pareto frontier, right? So you get a whole Pareto frontier. So the famous example from Samuelson is this, is that, let me draw this, guns and butter. So if you have amount of capital and labor in a country, you can produce guns and butter and trade them off along this path, right? So if you use all your capital and labor to produce guns, you will produce this amount of guns, If you use all your capital and labor to produce butter, produce this thing, and all along this path, you're Pareto efficient. What is Pareto inefficient? Pareto inefficient is producing at this point, right? So the whole idea of Pareto is that you're not wasting anything, right? So if you're using up all your resources and producing the maximum that you can produce, then you're Pareto efficient. And that means you can slightly produce this or less, can move things here and there, and you'll get a whole continuum of things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. do they all, is it all like the same output along the line, or is there like a maximum
No,
point?
so okay. Let me give you a simple example. You're in a coffee shop, working in a coffee shop as a manager, right? You can produce coffee or you can produce brownies. You can produce lots of coffees, but that means your labor and energy would be, you'll produce less number of brownies. You can produce a lot of brownies and less coffee. Till the time you're not wasting any resources in producing coffee or brownie, you're Pareto efficient. And you can see how you can, if you produce less brownie, you'll produce more coffee. So you're on the Pareto efficient frontier if you're not wasting any resources. Does it make sense?
Okay, yeah, it does. Thank you.
And so the simple thing is, you just have to think Pareto efficiency is where you're not wasting anything. All the transactions are taking place and you're not wasting anything. Right? And it's kind of it's something that if you are separated from somebody because of distance, then you're wasting something, right? Because you're not able to, you're not able to kind of bring them together. You're wasting something. If you can bridge, so if it is possible to bridge that gap and you're not bridging it, then it's Pareto inefficient. If it's impossible to bridge that gap, then you're Pareto efficient, right? So the idea being that if it's possible to make a road, but you're not making the road for some reason, that's Pareto inefficient. But if it's impossible to make a road, it's just not possible to make a road, then that's the efficient outcome. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So
like,
the idea, yeah.
Say if you were like better at producing guns and you just like put all your resources into producing guns,
Yeah.
would you have a point which is, or like you could put all your resources into producing butter? Would you be Pareto efficient producing
No,
butter? But you
so let's think of an example where you become, or you learn suddenly how to become more productive at producing guns, right? In a period. So what will happen is you'll move in this direction and your Pareto efficient frontier will start looking like this. If you become more productive in producing guns, your Pareto efficient frontier means that using capital and labor, you can produce more guns. So that means your Pareto frontier has improved. So every time A goes up, your Pareto frontier actually increases. Right? So it's kind of A has an effect. So moving from the red curve to the blue curve is A actually going up. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay. And so so the reason we have kind of slightly, oh no, it's just paucity of time. It's not we don't have enough time, but solo growth model talks about a one good world, right? There's one, apple orchard, we're producing apples can be used to grow trees, or apple can be consumed. When you start talking about multiple goods, then you start thinking about the Pareto frontier. And the idea is to think, are we using the capital labor properly? Are we using the capital labor properly to produce the maximum? And by the way, you can produce any of this. What ends up getting chosen would be determined by the market. So, it would be people's in different curves, and the slope between the two lines, would be the price, right? So the slope between the two lines would be the price. Okay. So the idea of misallocation is that you're below the Pareto frontier. Now, let's think of a couple of examples. Let's first think of a simple example, actually. I'm going to come back to the banking in a second. I'm going to do something much simpler. Discrimination. So all kinds of discrimination is misallocation of resources. So the second article that Heise wrote in 2013, he kind of quoted this as an example of misallocation. So in 1960 in the US, so this is an example from the US. In 1963 in US, 94% of the doctors and lawyers were white men. Does that mean women, non-white men, don't have the potential of being a good doctor? No, obviously, they have a potential of being a good doctor, but the resources were being misallocated because non-white people did not have an opportunity of becoming doctors. In 2008, 62% of the doctors and lawyers were white men. So it could be that, white men are slightly better at being doctors, and other people have other comparative advantages. So, or it could be that they don't have comparative advantage and the number should be 50-50. But the fact that these high-paying professions were only white men was a misallocation of resources. The second example of misallocation of resources is quite poignant. So Sarah Day Corner, who became a Supreme Court justice, she graduated third in a class from Stanford in 1952, and she couldn't get a job in the private sector. All she could do was become a legal secretary, right? She ended up becoming the Supreme Court justice, right? But because she was not white, she was not able to. Right. Now, the irony is this, when I was looking at these examples, is that this is a misallocation in an economy, which is the US economy, which is the most productive economy in the world. So US has been the most productive economy in the world since the 1880s, when it overtook UK. Before that, UK was the most productive economy in the world, growing at the fastest rate. So US is the most productive, but there's significant amount of misallocation, which means it's underperforming even its potential. Its potential is much greater. Another example, David Blackwell, he kind of developed something called contraction mapping. It's a mathematical notion. He's a famous economist, got admitted into National Academy of Sciences. When he completed his PhD at 22 and got a postdoc, he was not allowed to attend lectures, and he was denied employment. He was not hired at UC Berkeley for racial reasons. So this is examples of discrimination. Now, the useful thing is, discrimination is exactly like favoritism. And last time we looked at ethnic favoritism, right? So we looked at ethnic favoritism in the Kenya road building example, right? And so infrastructure is quite key in terms of driving resources where they should go, matching capital and labor and getting them in the right places, giving people market access. So markets working means that resources will be allocated. So infrastructure is quite important. You can see how stark these examples are in discrimination, but sometimes it's more difficult to drive and make people understand how small amounts of favoritism, like building the road at the wrong place, can create misallocation, right? So that's just one example. It kind of connects. So discrimination is misallocation. Ethnic favoritism is misallocation. And so the last example we did was how infrastructure can potentially take you to a higher per capita income, but because of the misallocation, and why was the misallocation happening? Because of ethnic favoritism in Kenya, it was leading you to a lower example. So we're getting two layered reasons why countries are poor. One reason why countries are poor is because their Pareto efficient place they can get to is low. And the second reason, they don't have enough capital accumulation. They don't have, the A is not growing fast enough. But even from there, you can get to a lower stage because of this allocation. Let me go back to the banking example, and that's kind of a more complicated example from India. And it's an interesting story. So what you usually have is firms invest, and they look at the marginal productive capital. So the idea is, if I invest £1,000 into my firm, I'm running a coffee shop. If I invest £1,000 into running the coffee shop, what is the return I'm going to get? If I get a return of 10%, and on the stock market, I get a return of 5%, or in my saving accounts, I get a return of 3%, then I would take my £1,000 and I would put it in my own coffee shop, because it's giving me a higher rate of return. I invest another £1,000, I invest another £1,000, and at some point, the return I would get would start getting close to 5%, which is what I would have got in the stock market. And at that point, if I have more money, I'll stop putting money into my own coffee shop, because the more I invest, the lower return I get. Why? Usually because of diminishing marginal productive capital, right? So as you add more and more capital, the capital at the margin is less productive. So at some point you reach a point at which your capital is only giving you a 5% return. And beyond that, if you invest, it'll start giving you 4.5%. And at that point, if you keep investing in your coffee shop, you're doing something wrong. You do something illogical, because you could get 5% out of the stock market. What that also means is that if I don't have the money to invest in my coffee shop I can get a 10% return, but I don't have the money. But somebody else in the economy has a saving. They should put it in, they put the money in the bank. The bank should lend it to me, because I'm getting 10%. The bank can lend it to me, and can charge me 5% for it, right? And so I can keep a little bit of it. The bank gets 5% of it, and the person who's putting their money into a saving account is getting 4% of it. So the bank gets a little bit to run its transaction, cover its transaction cost. So basically, the savers should save money, and this money should be fueled through the banking system to the most productive projects. So it turns out, if the banking system is not doing a job, that means somebody who's saving is not able to get an opportunity to invest through the stock market or through the bank into firms, which means if not enough saving is flowing through the banking system, that means the marginal product of capital, the marginal product of capital in the firms is higher than the rate people are getting at saving. Now, turns out, if for some reason you don't have a bank in your neighborhood, right? Your banks are really, really far, which means the only way in which you can borrow is to borrow informally from your relatives or from the local moneylender, and they're lending you at 20%. But somebody in an urban area in New York is lending at 2%. That means there's a huge opportunity for transaction. And what's stopping is this banking system not working. And so if you're in a rural area in sub-Saharan Africa, and you have an extremely productive project, you have market access, but you don't have a bank, chances are you'll not be able to borrow because you don't have a bank, right? So the misallocation that occurs when the banking system doesn't work is some people have very high rates of return, but they can't get money. Other people have savings, but they can't get those opportunities to invest and get the returns from the high productive project, right? And in developing countries, this usually happens because the cost of setting up a bank is high, and usually people set up banks, firms set up banks only in urban areas, profitable market segments in urban areas, and rural areas often have no access to banking, right? So large parts of the world, rural areas have no access to banking. I mean, it's a bit like in UK, there are large parts of UK which do not have access to postal services because there's no post office, right? It's exactly the similar kind of story. In developing countries, you can find banks in the urban areas, but you can't find it in the rural areas. So Robin Burgess at LSE started studying this along with Rohini Pandey. They started looking at banking in India because the banking policy in India is interesting. There's a nationalization of the banks, and in 1977, what the government of India says, and I'm going to tell you something really interesting here. The reason I'm going to tell you something interesting is you never hear stories about nationalization which are positive, right? So you never hear stories of governments doing something good. You often hear stories of governments doing something inefficient. But this is a story, one of those kind of unusual stories where the government was able to do something and they nationalized the banks. So they took private banks and they nationalized them. And it ended up creating a phenomenal growth story for India. So they nationalized the bank. And the reason Indira Gandhi nationalized the bank, the prime minister at that point, was because she wanted to drive the banking sector into the rural areas, because instinctively she and other people had understood that you had to drive finance to the rural areas if you wanted economic development to take place. So she nationalizes the bank in 1969. But turns out, even though she nationalizes the banks are still private entities. They don't want to open up bank account in the rural areas. Why don't they want to open up? Because they think, it's more profitable to be in the urban areas, and rural areas are not profitable. Why are rural areas not profitable? Because there's no economic activity. Why is there no economic activity? Because there are no banks. So there's no economic activity because there are no banks in the rural areas, and there are no banks because there's no economic activity. So it's like a feedback loop. It's caught in a bad situation. And Indira Gandhi and the party in power kind of had an instinct that if they were able to force banks to open in the rural areas, they can transform. So in 1977, 8 years after nationalization, so she nationalized the banks, but even after she nationalized, she was still not, banks are run by individuals who run the banks. She was still not able to push them. She was not a dictator. She was still working in a democracy. She was still not able to push these banks, nationalized banks, to open more banks. So the government brought in a 1-to-4 branch policy. So they brought in the famous 1-to-4 branch policy. What was 1-to-4 branch policy? The policy said that if you want to open up one bank in a banked area, what is a banked area? Where there's already a bank. So if you want to open up a bank near another bank, then you must open 4 banks in areas where there are no banks. Otherwise, you're not allowed to open a new bank. So it turns out you can see how in different states across the country, after 1977, so already banks were opening up, but after 1977, you can find that it dramatically started driving down the population per bank, right? So it started making banks more accessible, and you can see some kind of convergence. So there's some states which had low access to bank, other states which had high access. So high access and low access. But you can see that after 1997, it drives towards a convergence, and by 1979, 1980, almost all areas of the country had equal access to banks, right? So the banks were far more frequent. So what happens? What happens is this. So let's look at 1987. So the probability, basically what you find is the probability of getting the loans was significantly high. What it also does across the country is that it drives up the per capita income in the non-agriculture sector. The agriculture sector doesn't change that much, because if you have a bank, agriculture sector capitalizing it is more expensive. But if you have a small factory, adding more capital can be far more productive. So non-farm output, non-agriculture output dramatically starts taking off after the bank nationalization rates. So this is in per capita income terms. What we find is this is looking at it state-wise. So the figures I gave you earlier was looking at country-wise. This is state-wise, and you can see that in around 1977, there's an increase in pace in terms of bank branches being created across different parts. And this is the poverty headcount ratio, which is proportion of people who are poor. And you can see almost everywhere, the poverty is declining. And the Burgess paper shows that you can actually attribute causation to the bank branch opening, right? So you can actually, it's not that other things were happening at the same time. You can actually iterate, because what they find is that wherever you opened a bank, there was one person, for 1% increase in credit, 1.5% decrease in poverty, and for 1% increase in saving, 2.2% decrease in poverty. So the banks gave people access to credit. When they increased credit, poverty went down. When they increased saving, the poverty went down even further. And this is the fascinating thing, which is saving is often more crucial than credit for driving that poverty. If you're a poor person, you may not want to start an entrepreneurial venture, but you may want, whatever little you save, you may want to save it and get a high rate of return in that. So what is the banking story here? What the banking story simply here is that the government was pushing the banks to open in rural areas so that you could equalize marginal productive capital, return on capital, from the urban centers and the kind of areas where the economy was growing fast to rural areas. You could equalize. If you don't have a local bank, you're disconnected. Just the way you're disconnected if you don't have a road. If you have a road but you don't have a bank, you're disconnected from the financial system. Now this colorful graph is the growth story of India. The colors all relate to different prime ministers. And we were just talking about Indira Gandhi. She was the prime minister who in 1977 brought in the 1-to-4 rule. Now, something interesting to notice is that the growth rate before 1977 was 0.78%. And since about, 1980s, the growth rate of the economy has been 5.68%. So from being a really sluggish economy, India's growth rate has gone up significantly. And one of the reasons people attributed, and we're not still sure because there are various reasons that this could have changed. One of the candidates for this change is the banking sector. There are other candidates as well. And there's a paper I have in your reference, one of the optional reference, which by Kaushik Basu on India's growth story. And that's a paper where the paper discusses, it's a really easy paper to read, but they discuss various candidates for the growth story. Right. By the way, if you're worried I've not done enough lecture slides, the lecture slides, the main part of the lecture is the next few slides. After that, it's just a bit of an overview. Now, let me show you something more interesting, which is from another paper I pulled out, the productivity at the firm level in different states. So what we're talking about here is the A at the level of the firm. So there's data on all the firms in a particular state. So there's data on all the firms in a particular state. And from that, you have data on the capital and labor. And from that, you can calculate the A, the productivity level. And if you calculate all the productivity levels of all the firms in a particular state, what happens is something interesting. So let's look at this more carefully. What happens in 1980 is that the distribution of productivity looks like this, right? This is the log scale. And 1997, the distribution has changed. How has the distribution changed? The first thing to notice is that the mean has gone up from, these are log values, from 4.57 to 5.56. The mean of the A value has gone up, but also the shape has changed. So the shape of the distribution was very kind of pushed in, whereas it has become, the shape of the distribution has become flatter. Now, what does that basically mean? That means what this gives you is the range from the most productive to the least productive firm in a state. So this is the least productive firm, and this is the most productive firm. And the question is, what's the distribution? And turns out what we find is that from 1980 to 1997, the distribution has shifted in this direction. So the distribution has shifted a little bit more, where the mean is higher, which means the firm, which is now the most productive firm in 1997, was more productive, but the firms that were less productive also has become more productive. So the whole productivity distribution has changed, and that productivity distribution has changed because some kind of a misallocation problem was solved. And what the HISO hypothesis on misallocation said was that actually, if you look at India and China, and you look at how the firms are organized in India and China, how the resource allocation is taking place, the capital and labor is just not properly allocated in India and China compared to the US. And they ask a really simple hypothetical question. What if you took all the capital and labor in India and reallocated it just the way it's allocated in US? So even though you have lower amounts of capital and more labor than US, if you reallocate just the way the firms allocate capital and labor in the US, they find that India would be 50%, 40 to 60% richer, and China would be 30 to 50% richer, right? So the misallocation problem has a huge impact. And these other distributions are just showing that firm level distributions move. So what happens is that when the allocation starts taking place properly, firm level productivity starts shifting towards the right. This is slightly complicated. If you have any questions, happy to answer it. So Heise and Kenlo basically say that they study misallocation in manufacturing plants in India and China, and they find huge productivity differences across firms. So some firms are more productive within a country or within a state. They're more productive, some are less. But they find that there's significant misallocation of inputs because something's not working, right? They are not able to pin down what's not working. They can only say something's not working. Whether markets are not working or infrastructure is not working, that's difficult. That's where the literature is. That's where trying. But what it tells you is one way to look at it, and traditionally when we looked at it, was solo growth model. Everyone looked at solo growth model and say, how can we use the growth framework? We can accumulate more capital. Turns out, Heise and Kenlo come in 2009 and say, look, it's not just about capital accumulation. It's also about once you accumulate capital, how do you get capital to the right place? How do you get labor to the right place, right? If you don't get capital to the right place, if you don't get labor to the right place, if there's some discrimination, if women, if there's gender discrimination, if there's racial discrimination, if there's caste discrimination, if there are, kind of infrastructure is being built at the wrong place, you're going to get misallocation. And misallocation is going to account for a huge lost opportunity, right? And so the interesting thing is to contrast solo growth model and the misallocation hypothesis. And by the way, that's your term paper, right? So I'll talk about the term paper in a second, but that's your term paper. Now, I'm just going to quickly just talk about various different kind of infrastructures. I'm going to show you some pictures. So railways, what does railway do? Roads are more flexible, but railways have a higher fixed cost. When you want to build up a railway, it's a higher fixed cost, but then the cost of traveling across space becomes really, really, really cheap. And there's a lovely paper by Donaldson, which shows, and this is a paper which looks at railway construction in British India and what it did to resource allocation. So it kind of predates, Donaldson's early work predates Heise, but his 2008, so he has some interesting stories about what happened in India from 1853 to 1990 and how it changed because of railway construction, just the way we've talked about in the US. the Erie Canal changed the structure of the economy. Railway construction in India changed the structure of the economy, and it reduced inter-regional price differentials. So if you had wheat in one part of the country, but the price of wheat that you were getting was low, but the price of wheat was higher in another part of the country, what it did was, railways did was reduce that differential. And it found that there were some places which had railway next to it and other places not, right? So railways, railways were built across India, but railways did not penetrate all the areas of India. I mean, most countries have very, very limited access to railways. The exception to this is Germany. Germany has extensive railways all across India. And the fascinating thing is Germany has almost as much rail length as a small country as India has. India has a lot of rail length, but Germany has almost the same rail length. So Germany, every village is connected to the railway. Right. So, and it kind of tells you why Germany is such a balanced economy, and Germany has been such a powerhouse, because the railway is the canal system. It just kind of allows everything to move. Once you've put the fixed cost of building the railway, everything moves more easily. What Donaldson finds is some districts got access to railway, other didn't. The districts that got integrated with railway got 16% more agriculture income relative to those that did not, right? Picture tells you railway per capita, road pattern. We've talked a lot about roads, and this is just a simple story. It's a bit of an overview of roads, what's happening with roads across the world. What is the per capita what's the per capita road in different parts of the world? Communication, it tells you what has happened to total phones per capita in the recent period. And obviously, as you see in developed countries, it has gone up significantly. But in Northern Africa and Latin America and South Asia, phones per capita hasn't changed significantly. Sub-Saharan Africa, it hasn't. And this data finishes in 2000, so it's kind of slightly incomplete. I mean, this infrastructure data is more difficult to get. I don't have data in the last 20 years. Electricity generating capacity, again, what you see is in developed countries, you have significantly higher electricity generating capacity, Eastern Europe, whereas in developing countries, electricity generating capacity is extremely low. So that is an easy kind of thing that's being missed out. Electricity generating capacity is an easy thing that's being missed out, because if you increase your electricity generating capacity, you can significantly push up your productivity. Why isn't that happening? Really interesting set of stories. I wish I had more time in terms of this lecture. So that's basically a summary of everything that we talked about. The key thing that I've been trying to put across is why are countries poor? What are the explanations? Solo growth model, misallocation hypothesis, and how does the role of the government, especially through public goods provision and infrastructure, change things? So I've talked a lot about communication and transportation, and how that can change things. And if I had more time, I would have liked to talk about social infrastructure, so health and education. We talked a little bit about it, but the key bit is to think about, especially because it's more related to construction, which is how transport and communication infrastructure can dramatically change the structure of the economy. And the key bit to understand it is the role of the market, right? Market allows things to be allocated to the right place. Without market, you'd have to be a superhuman being to be able to direct and allocate things. So, the earlier story was that smart people can actually allocate resources across the economy. Turns out, we find that the more decentralized allocation mechanism, the more the market gets involved, the better the economy does, with the caveat that markets need infrastructure to function, right? So if you are in a developing country and you're thinking about, from a social perspective, what's the best infrastructure to build, you have to think about, how can I build an infrastructure so that I can support the markets which can allocate resources in an efficient way. And that's it. That's the course to an end. Let me show you the question for the term paper. The term paper says, and I'm reading out the question, the background, and this is not part of the question, the background is solo growth model, and the isoclino misallocation hypothesis offer two competing explanations for why countries remain persistently poor. So why do countries remain in poverty trap? There are two competing hypotheses. What the essay, a 1,000-word essay that you need to write as a term paper requires you to do is to look at this, critically evaluate and compare solo growth model and the isoclino misallocation hypothesis explanation for why some countries remain persistently poor. So what's not important is describing solo growth model and the misallocation hypothesis. What's important is to evaluate and compare them, critically evaluate them. So think about, what the comparative advantages are, what the disadvantages are, what the caveats are, what the assumptions are. And then explain how infrastructure can raise per capita income in the two approaches. I think the answer is, the essay is quite easy to do. I mean, all you need to do is look through the lecture material and read the papers I've set out for you. I've told you a story, and if you just repeat that story, that gives you some kind of an essay, decent essay. But I have given you readings which push you a little further. So the way you are going to be evaluated is, can you get the basic story right? But from that, can you push forward, use those articles to get a deeper understanding? Any questions either about the lecture material or this term paper?
I've got a very quick question,
Sure.
Kamal. It's definitely 1,000 words, right? It's not
So,
3,000.
Yeah, it's absolutely 1,000 words, and there is a reason for this. And the reason is that it's always more difficult to write a short piece than a longer piece. Because when you do a long piece, you can write everything. You don't need to prioritize what's important and what's less important. When you're forced to write a shorter piece, your writing skills improve, and your writing skills is what is going to help you in life later on. 1,000 words for me is usually the perfect space where people don't get very descriptive. And I should add, you didn't ask this question, but I should add this, which is, don't start writing without thinking through, right? So think about this issue. It's an intellectual course. Read the material, think about it, develop an argument, and then answer. And it's 1,000 words. If you go to the bottom of the thing, the school's word limit policy is there. So it's a detailed policy in what counts and what doesn't count. It also tells you that there is a leeway of 10%. So, sorry, 150 words do not count. There's a leeway of 10%. So if you are 1,100 words or 900 words, that's absolutely fine. It doesn't matter. I'm not that finicky about words anyway. So, I'm not going to count every single word. Till the time you're around 1,000 words, 1,100 words, it's fine. If you're going to have 1,500 words, I'll have no option but to penalize you. Does that answer your question, Sabir?
Yes, that does. So that means we're not really expected to put a exact summary at the beginning or an intro, a very vivid intro, I assume. And the other thing.
So I have instructions on what an intro does. Okay, so I am very happy to read good pieces of writing.
Okay.
So this is why this part says advice. So I'm happy to read good pieces of writing. That's entirely up to you. But what an introduction should do is create curiosity and a context. The introduction should definitely not say a lot of countries in the world are poor. That's, for a lack of a better, more polite word, that's really a silly way to start things, because you're just being banal and trivial when you write that. It's a rhetorical statement.
Yeah.
So an introduction should be something that creates a context. Read newspaper articles, good newspaper articles, and the first line is something that catches your attention and says, I'm going to give you a context, or kind of, watch a good television series. If you watch the first 10 minutes and you get bored, you're going to switch off. A good television series, what it does, it captures something and pulls your attention, right? So good introduction is a context. It says, this essay is worth reading. So that's a good introduction. What a good conclusion does is it basically makes the point that is important. So it kind of draws the attention of the reader to the essential point. If they have read through it and they missed it, it says, this is the essential argument that I'm making. It also offers you opportunity for reflection. So reflection about what could be done further, or reflection, any kind of reflection that you have, which is insightful, right? The marking criteria, and I am very, very careful about marking things objectively, as far as I can, objectively, using the marking criteria. So everything that I'm going to use to mark, I've set in very carefully. 20% of your marks will be allocated to presentation. So what is a presentation? What are the criteria for presentation? A well-written introduction and conclusion of the essay, right? So if you've not written a introduction which is good, you'll be marked down. If you've not written a good conclusion, you'll be marked down. So it should have a well-written introduction and conclusion, and the normal presentation rules, which is, you shouldn't have bullet points, normal essay rules. It should look decent. It should not reflect a lack of, you should reflect the effort you've put in. The main thing for the essay is that 50% of the mark is knowledge and understanding of the course material. So the essay should reflect the author's familiarity with the definition and economic terms in the course material. So I'm sure all of you are extremely conscientious, but one of the problems that we are having is that people are going to professional essay writers and they submit essays. This, and usually with my courses, that becomes really difficult, because any professional writer will not be familiar with the latest research that I'm putting out there in the course material. And so, right, so I would really suggest that don't go down that path. I'm sure none of you are going to do that path, but odd people always go and get professional writers. If you do that, I'm going to take I'm going to take that really, really seriously. It's also what's also important is every citation that you quote, you should have read that paper. Don't quote something without reading that paper, because if you quote it wrong, I'm going to penalize you. You can't read the abstract of a paper and say, oh, I understand this, and that's it. People often are very careless about citing. They don't read the paper, and just for the heck of it, they cite things. I don't need any citation. I need a good argument. I don't care about citation. Citation don't give you marks. But if you quote something wrong, you get penalized. So reflection of knowledge and understanding, the key concepts, the key definitions, the essay should reflect a nuanced and critical understanding of the course material. So the basic objective of this term paper is to see, do you understand the course material? So no rhetorical statements required, no kind of general kind of observations about the world. What I want to know is, have you read the course material? Have you thought about it? Have you understood it? That's 50%. 30% is, can you use that knowledge and understanding to effectively make an argument? Any report that you write for a firm that you're working for, it's based on knowledge and your ability to argue. If you don't have knowledge, you can't argue. If you just write about knowledge and you don't make an argument, you don't build it together in an argument, that piece of writing is not worth anything. So 30% is your ability to critically analyze the topic, structured arguments, substantiate your opinions. If you want to have an opinion, put it towards the end, but substantiate your opinion. So the question is, have you read the material and can you effectively argue? Reading the material is more important. Understanding the material is more important. Effectively arguing is important, but it's kind of a next stage. I'm sorry, I hope I'm not being too emphatic. I'm just tired. But this is basically the format. So my advice would be to kind of follow the marking criteria very carefully, read the material, try to understand it. And I've asked a question which reflects directly the debates that we've been having for the last 5 weeks in the course. And that's all you need to do. You need to reflect that debate. And using the debate, if you read more papers, it's going to update your knowledge. But when you read the paper, don't just read it trivially. Think about that paper. And what I can guarantee you is this. The more effort you put into the essay and the term paper, the higher mark would be. Because that always happens. That's the way I've designed this. The second thing, the more time you spend thinking about things, the higher your mark would be. So your productivity will, productivity in terms of marks will increase with the more time you spend reading the material and reflecting on it. If you want to take a shortcut and just do the basic thing, your chances are, if you put in the minimum amount of effort, that would reflect in a simple answer, which is just a version of the lecture notes. And then that means you're going towards very close towards the mean mark. Okay, I hope that answers it, and I hope that wasn't too long. Any more questions on this?
Hi, Huma. Will your office hours still be running next couple of weeks?
It's a good idea to, not exactly, because the university shuts down from April 1 to April 10. But I'm around. If you drop me an email, I'm happy to set up a time and talk. I mean, we can still talk on Wednesday, but basically what happens is, all my courses have come to an end. So on Wednesday, it's very unlikely that anybody will be in my office hour. So I'm not going to look at it. But if you drop me a line the day before, I'm happy to meet you in the office hour or any other time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So there's a question. So we also need to say why some countries remain persistently poor using two approaches. I would suggest that you should rethink what you've said, because you're missing the point of the two approaches. You are missing the relationship between the two approaches. Okay, so this is a point in which you've just been introduced to these approaches, so it's not surprising that you have not absorbed it, but it's not like there's approach 1 and there's approach 2, and they are going in different directions. They are intricately related and they are dependent on one another. And to answer the question, you have to understand the relationship between these two approaches. And you would also find that if you go back to my first, second, and third and fourth lecture, in every lecture, I was telling you some nuance which will help you appreciate this, the difference between the two approaches. So when you go back and look at the old material, having looked at misallocation hypothesis, you will see the lecture material in a different way, with a different light. Okay, any more questions?
Yeah, I have one question.
Sure.
Do you suggest to start reading the material? I say that because we have another term paper until 26th of April. So my first thought was to give time for the first term paper, reading and writing, and then the next 2 weeks about the second. It doesn't matter the sequence. But do you suggest to build our understanding from now until the end of the April, or 2 weeks are enough?
No, so here's the thing.
Prepare?
Here's the thing, which is the reason this is a difficult question to answer is because there are two things that I don't know. One is for each individual person, how much time they've spent looking at the lecture material while the course was going on.
Okay.
So if you and other people have spent time looking at the lecture material, you would already be far ahead.
Mhm.
And you literally have to put very little effort, because if you've understood the solo growth model, if you understood how markets work, understanding misallocation, hypothesis, and going over the material is literally a matter of a couple of days, reading a couple of articles, and then your term paper is done. So it entirely depends on how conscientious you and other students have been in terms of that. The second thing is that the writing of the term paper, at least the way I like to examine, is I'm asking you for your intellectual input, which means it has to be bunched together. If you do some bit work here and then you do something 3 days later, chances are the insight that you gained, you would have lost and you would not build on it. So here's what happens. You go and read a paper and you understand something in the paper, but there's something that you don't understand, but it's kind of at the back of your mind and your brain is processing. Next day, if you spend time again reading something related and working on it, the thought that was unclear becomes clearer. And that's how you get deeper and deeper insight into a problem. If you do a paper today, but then pick up the term paper 3 days later, that slight thing that you had developed gets lost.
Mhm.
So it's
Yeah,
very inefficient to kind of spread the work out. It's much more efficient to say, I'm going to spend the next 4 days working on the same paper, read it, think about it, read it, think about it, and then finish it. Also, if you've done the reading material, but you leave it for a little while, you may lose it. The second thing is, for any piece of writing, and I absolutely know that you have time constraint. The second draft has a huge improvement over the first draft. And the reason is because when you write your first draft, it's like you're trying to tell somebody a story. When you read your first draft after a couple of days, then it's like somebody from the past telling you your story. So you're telling yourself the story and you have questions and you start arguing with yourself. So the second draft, when you rewrite the second draft, it has a huge improvement. And then if you want to be absolutely perfect, you write a third draft. And I'm talking more about the dissertation here. People who write 3 drafts for their dissertation are almost guaranteed to get a plus 70. People who don't write the third draft often find it very difficult. But in terms of a term paper, I think writing 3 drafts is too much. But if you want to do well, at least write a second draft. So work for 3 or 4 days or 5 days, write a draft, and then leave it for a couple of days, and then go back and read your own draft, and you'll find huge amount of potential for improvement. So that would be my ideal kind of scenario. And this is based on, I've spent a lot of time teaching. It's based on most students tend to benefit a lot from working in a concentrated period of time on something, then leaving it for a little while and going back and looking at the draft. But when you finish that period, make sure you've written a draft. If you don't write a draft, you lose the insights that you've gathered. Does that answer your question, Aristia?
Yeah, true. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, but I don't think anybody would require more than 4 or 5 days of work at the maximum to write the first draft. So I'm thinking 4 to 5 days of work, which means kind of 28 to 35 hours. That's quite a lot for this term paper if you've been following the lectures. If you haven't followed the lectures, obviously it's going to take you a longer time.
Yeah, I think that
But,
most of us, I am speaking personally, but I think it's for the majority, that we are connected to the lectures, but not to the readings because we have other essays and dissertation.
no, of course,
and
of course.
yeah,
Of course.
I think that it's
So
for
the lecture material, if you've absorbed, gets you to a 60 plus. But to get to the 70 plus area, readings start becoming important.
Okay, yeah.
Because what the reason the readings become important is because The reason it become important is because while you're reading, your brain does a lot of calculations and a lot of somersaults and a lot of things. You know, when you hear somebody, you know, you're getting a story, your brain is not active. It's when you start reading and when you start writing, that's when your brain starts really fleshing out things. So let me tell you something that you might find interesting, which is I spent a lot of time studying economics in my life. I actually understood economics, started understanding economics properly only when I started teaching. So when I had to speak, you know, when I had to speak and when I had to kind of explain it to the other people, that's when I started understanding, you know, 10 years ago, I'd learned this in my undergraduate, actually didn't understand it at that point. Now I understand it. So this is why, you know, the process of reading and writing, that's when you start getting things, right? So it depends on what you're hitting for. If you're hitting for 60 plus, the lecture material should be fine. But if you're looking for a 70 plus, then you don't have to do all the readings, but you'd have to at least do the readings which are, you know, kind of related to the topic. And I have tried to be careful in kind of giving you the least amount of reading compared to your UCL course. CPM tends to be low on reading, so I might be higher on the, you know, my reading list might be longer, but by UCL standards, I have tried to keep it on the lower side.
Okay.
The reading list, okay? And I've only kept readings which I think you'll remember 3 or 4 years from now, and you know, you'd kind of say, I'm glad I did that reading because now I can see how this really matters in the real life. Okay, so all the readings I put there are gems. And so it's not just about the term paper. If you can read those readings, that will change the way you look at life, that will change the way you understand society around you, understand the firm that you're working for. So these readings are important in terms of, you know, your cognitive development.
Okay, so sure, I will read it.
Yeah, I mean, you know,
I'll try.
Try. I mean, you know, you don't have to read all of them, but at least try to read 3, 4 of them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Any more questions?
Sorry, just one last question. So if
Sure.
I use, for example, a solo equations in the solo growth model, can I put that in an appendices or any graphs that I use? Or do I have to put in the main body of the essay?
You can create an appendix, but the word limit applies.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you know, here I'm kind of, you know, helping you out. The question is not about the derivation.
Yeah.
The question is, you know, I don't see any point in putting a derivation in this question. Okay. I mean, you know, if you do a derivation in this question, one is the question is not about the derivation of the model, right?
Yeah.
The question is about critically evaluate. So it's the derivation is the mechanical part of a model. The way the model works is that you have some assumptions and you have results, and the mechanical bit is the derivation. So the mechanical bit, which is the derivation, right? You know, once you make the assumption, the result is obvious. It might take, because we are human, it takes us a while to derive it, but actually that's a very mechanical process. The complicated process is about how do you make the right set of assumptions to get the right result. So if you put the derivation, I don't think it adds anything significant. The second thing is, if you're copying and pasting derivation from the lecture notes, what I mean by copying and pasting the derivation means that you're just taking the derivation from the lecture notes, you're not doing anything new, then, you know, that has no value to it, right? So think about how you're going to add value to this. If you want the derivation to show something which is beyond what's in the lecture material, then there is a point in putting the derivation.
Yeah, thank you.
And can I just specify?
Yeah.
Questions which say derive this or show this is usually kind of indications that you're supposed to show this or you're supposed to derive it. So that's a question which is more like, show me that you know how this model is derived. The word critically, so you know the words, so I've used the words quite carefully. Critically evaluate and compare, I've used the words carefully, right? And you all know that I told you that I'll set up this thing a week ago, but I wrote a draft and I kept moving the words because I've chosen each word very, very carefully. So when I say critically evaluate and compare, I mean that very, very carefully. When I say explain, I mean that word very, very carefully, right? So my suggestion to you would be that unless and until you find some particular use for derivation, some particular thing that it communicates, unless you find that, don't actually put it. And having said that, if you have any doubts about this, you want to say something and you're not being able to say, come back and kind of, drop me an email and come back to chat with me in the office hour. And I'm happy to talk about whether it adds value or not. I won't tell you anything that will help you and be unfair to others, but I'm happy to chat in terms of, kind of clarifying whether you're adding value or not. Okay.
Thanks for the answer.
Right. Can I just say, it would be very, very useful if all of you could fill in the questionnaire. And the reason is because we've done this course in a very unusual atmosphere, and next year we don't know whether it will be online or offline. And so having a clear feedback in how you experience the course, whether it was too difficult, whether it was too easy, would be very, very useful. And what is also particularly useful is written comments. So if you have something in writing that often reflects and allows us to, allows me and allows the department to kind of make sure that the next cohort benefits from your insights. So, you may have a reflection which will be much better put in words. The questionnaire just says, is it a good course? Is it a bad course? And, if you say it's a good course, I'll smile. If you say it's a bad course, I'll say, well, I tried my best. But in a way, that doesn't have less impact. If you write down words, even if there are short words in terms of reflection on the course, those words often carry a lot of weight, right? And if you don't want to put that in the questionnaire and you want to write me an email about how you think the course could have been done better, I'd be very, very happy to kind of receive your comments. The reading list only has, the last bit, reading list only has 2 chapters, which are on the book, which are part of the reading list. But I've been writing, so this is going to be a book, and I've been writing other chapters, and I'm going to add those chapters on in a few days. So you can have a look. These chapters would be along the lines of the lecture, but they're not essential part of the reading, right? So I have some interesting examples of how medieval markets used to work across countries and across oceans and how they developed their own governance system. So there's an interesting economic history literature on that. So I'll be adding chapters onto that because I'm just building up my own book that I want to write. But if you check back and you find more chapters, they're not part of the reading list, but you're welcome to look at it. And if you have any thoughts on what you find there, very happy to hear from you. That's it. Thank you very much. It's been absolutely a pleasure teaching all of you. While talking, I have imagined your faces. In a lecture theater is great because by the end of 5 weeks, you kind of get to know each other quite well. You know the expressions, ask questions, push each other, kind of have fun. We haven't had that, but I've heard your voices here and there. Some of you I know from other places, from other kind of in teaching environments. I knew Dominic before I came here. I knew Philip before I came here. I met Aristia, but others I have come to know through the course. It's been absolutely a pleasure, and I hope you got something away from the course. And all I can tell you is that when you're writing the third paper, you can be absolutely assured that when I mark the paper, I mark it very carefully. I mark it very carefully. I don't mark it subjectively. I mark it and try my best to give you benefit of the doubt. Try my best to give you the mark that you deserve. Try the best to give you the feedback that I think you want. So when you write the term paper, remember that you're putting in an effort, and you're putting in an effort. I'm going to put the similar amount of effort in correcting it. So, it's not just about the mark. It's about kind of your term paper is a way of communicating to me, you're going to write, and I'm going to read your reflections on that. And to me, that's another way of communicating about the material that we've kind of explored together. So thank you very much. Hope you have a lovely day. We are ending on a sunny day, and hopefully at some point I'll get to meet some of you in person. Anything else? Anybody has a question? Okay. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Thank you.
Bye.